everyone, welcome back to my channel and welcome to part 2 of my mid-year palette usage videos. If you did miss part 1, I will link that up in the cards. That goes over my first quarter of the year palette usage, which palettes I was reaching for, how many times I reached for them, and what percentage of my collection I successfully reached for. Does that make sense? And in today's video, part 2, we're going to go through my palette usage from April, May, and June, and at the end we'll be wrapping up my mid-year palette usage, how I've been doing, have I reached for 50% of my collection in the first 50% of the year. We'll be chatting about all of that in today's video, so if that is something that interests you, then just keep on watching. If you watched part 1, my Q1 palette usage, you will know I was so pleased with myself in the first quarter of the year. I successfully reached for 1/4 of my eyeshadow palette collection. Now, between quarter 1 and quarter 2, my eyeshadow palette collection did increase by 3 palettes, so we are now going to be pulling from a pool of 95 eyeshadow palettes in total, and we're going to go through all the palettes I used in the second quarter of the year from the least used to the most used. So first we're going to start off with palettes I only reached for 1 time, ending with a palette I reached for the very most over the last 3 months. There were 9 eyeshadow palettes I reached for 1 time each. First, I have my Juvia's Place Magic Mini palette. When I open this palette, my eye is automatically drawn to these very deep shades here at the bottom, which for me personally makes me think of winter makeup. However, all of these like reddish, orange, peachy kind of shades at the top were perfect for spring, so I wanted to make sure I used this at least once in the spring months. I reached for my Urban Decay Born to Run palette 1 time. I was inspired by one of Angela Bright's Christmassy tutorials. She posts tutorials all through December using like throwback palettes, and she used Born to Run for one of them, and I was like, ooh, I have that palette, I'm going to follow this tutorial to get some use out of it. And I was just reminded how much I really do like this palette. I think the formula in these palettes is much better than their Naked palette, so I wish they'd do more with this formula. Next we have a repeat. This is the Dose of Colors Marvelous Mauves palette. I reached for this another 1 time in the second quarter. Not really sure why that is, probably because I'm trying to pan kind of a mauvey rosy type of shimmer shade, so sometimes I just want to reach into here for the mattes. Strangely enough, I have 3 more repeats I used 1 time. I have the Ace Beauté Vintage Dawn palette. I was trying to finish testing this and using every single shade, so I must have finally done that in the second quarter of the year. My ABH Sultry palette, this is one I just randomly reach for time to time, even though it's not in any projects. And then similarly to the Vintage Dawn, I have my BH Cosmetics Blueberry Muffin palette that I was also trying to have used every single shade. Not necessarily no pan left behind as in my project, but just so I have an understanding of all of the different finishes and formulas in this palette and know that I've used all of the shades in here at least once since I've owned the palette. A palette I rolled into my deck of panning project pan is my e.l.f. quad. This is in Chocolate Mint. I only want to use this 5 times, but in the second quarter of this year I only reached for 1 of those 5 times. I struggle to reach for this because it's so tiny, it gets kind of lost in my palette drawer. So if you have any tips and tricks for teeny tiny palettes, let me know, because that's often the case in my collection personally. But this is a really cute springy palette. and I'm happy to have reached for it. 2 palettes to go that I have reached for one time. My Odin's Eye Merry Christmas palette was just recently rolled into No Pan Left Behind. So despite getting some pretty solid use on it in the first quarter of the year, I had put it away, and then it got drawn into that roulette style project pan, in which I'm now trying to use all of the shades again, which is very fun. I did allow that to go through because I just had so much fun working with this. Odin's Eye is one of my very favorites, as I keep saying on my channel. So even though I had already technically No Pan Left Behinded this in 2024, I'm doing it again and properly tracking it this time for that project. I love this palette a lot, but it was just recently pulled into that project. So as of, April, May, and June, I had only reached for it the once. So I guess that's a spoiler for Q3. You'll be seeing a higher number. And the last palette I only reached for once was my Cosmic Beauty Delicious Delights palette. A fun, bright, colorful palette. This just screams spring summer to me. This palette is a lot of fun to reach for, but I only reached for it once in Q2. As with the last one, many of these palettes you are seeing are in project pans. I work on a lot of project pans, a lot of palettes, and that is the easiest way for me to rotate through my collection, though I am trying to be better about shopping my stash. I have 2 palettes that I used 2 times. The first is a repeat from Q1 when I No Pan Left Behinded this palette. It is now also rolled in to No Pan Left Behind officially now, in which I am tracking my usage, but I did only use this twice in Q2. And then a palette that I just recently rolled into my Project 10 Uses, my Sephora Pro Warm, and I have 2 tracked uses on this palette, in which I'm specifically using this shade here called Cedar. You live in a rural community when the tractor is distracting you from your filming because it's being very loud. Even though I'm specifically trying to work on this one shade, I do tend to reach for other shades in the palette along with that. I don't like just narrowly focusing in on one eyeshadow in a whole palette and only using that one, so I tend to reach for, 2 or 3 shades in a palette. What are they doing? I reached for 2 palettes 3 times each in the second quarter of the year. First, to finish off No Pan Left Behind, I reached for my ColourPop Smoke and Roses palette 3 times in Q2, which is about on par for what I reached for in Q1. I believe it was 4 in the first 3 months of the year and then 3 uses in the second quarter of the year. I'm happy to have gotten a good bit of use on this palette. And then I also reached for my Cosmic Beauty Serenity palette 3 times in the second quarter of the year. Love this palette so much. I'm trying not to be too repetitive, but this was used 7 times in the first quarter of the year, 3 times in the second quarter, meeting my 10 use goal in a project. I have 1 palette here that I used 4 times in Q2, and that is my Odin's Eye Christmas Eve palette. Once again, this is in my Project 10 Uses. I really enjoyed working with this palette, even though it's very Christmassy themed. I still created some fun looks. I'm actually using it today, so again, you're going to see it again in Q3. I love the mix of the blues and purples with these grungier shades as well, like this kind of grungy green. This pukey weird brown shade is actually very beautiful. I just have a lot of fun with this palette. I upped my usage on my Pretty Vulgar Nightingale palette in the second quarter of the year and reached for this one 5 times to roll it out of my Project 10 Uses. This one's kind of sad. This is the Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette. I reached for it 6 times in Q2. However, I'm trying to hit pan on the shade Marzipan here, and I fully am aware that that's going to take so much work and dedication, and I have not been showing this palette the dedication it deserves, and I do want pans showing in here. I'm so sorry about the background noise. And yet I keep bopping around my collection, so it's really hard for me to find the balance. I want pans showing my collection. I feel so satisfied hitting pans, and yet I want to rotate through and touch everything and not let anything get too neglected. So I don't know what the answer is, you know? I reached for this 6 times. Another palette I reached for 6 times is my Glamlight Ice Cream Dream palette. I love this palette so much. This palette is so much fun for me. It is currently going in Project 10 uses, but I am reaching for this beyond the shade I'm supposed to be working on. I'm constantly bopping around in here, apparently that's my saying for the day, reaching for so many of the colors to finish off makeup looks. I just love this palette. I don't always create a full look out of this palette, but I will be inspired to reach for, you know, one shade or another and then create my look around that, incorporating other palettes as well. This is well loved from me. I see some dips in here. Someday I would love some pans showing in here to truly show how much I love it, but there's a dip in salted caramel, there is a dip in pistachio, a dip in French vanilla, a little bit of a dip in blueberry cheesecake. Like, I just love this palette so much. We are now at the final 2, my top 2 most used palette. The first is my Project Level Up Level 3 palette. This is a ColourPop Mocktail Quad, and I used it 10 times in the second quarter of the year. My goal is to hit 3 pans in this palette, or at least use 3 of the shades 30 times. So I do need to bump up the usage, but I don't know if you can see from here. Maybe not according to my monitor. We've got some good usage going in here. 10 uses in the second quarter of the year and 3 uses in the first quarter of the year, because that was around the time it got rolled in. So I have some hard work ahead of me on this guy, but you'll be seeing this again. And lastly, I'm sure this is no surprise to anybody, my most used palette in the second quarter of the year is the same as the most used palette in the first quarter of the year. It is my ABH Modern Renaissance palette, because I am trying to finish the shade Tempera, and it's taking me a long time, even though it should be the easiest shade. I use this almost every time I do my makeup to set my eyeshadow primer in my crease to help with blending. I do not set my entire lid, so maybe that's why it's going so stinking slowly. But in the second quarter of the year, I reached for this palette 35 times. I need that number to be higher. I need to be doing my makeup more often, considering my expansive makeup collection and my makeup use-up goals. If I have a hope and a prayer of finishing this dang eyeshadow by the end of the year, I need to be doing my makeup more than 35 times in 3 months. But to wrap up my Q2 palette usage, I use 19 eyeshadow palettes in the second quarter of the year. That is 4 less than the first quarter, meaning I only used 20% of my collection in the second quarter of the year, which doesn't sound so bad. The first quarter of the year I used 25% of my collection, and in the second quarter of the year I used 20% of my collection, feeling like we should be at 45% or very close to my goal. As I'm sure you have realized, many of the palettes I just shared with you are actually repeats from the first quarter of the year, which I knew was going to happen. As a project panner, I'm often reaching for the same palettes again and again, and I'm not completely resetting all of my projects each quarter and reaching for a whole new selection of palettes. So in order to combat this, I'm going to have to be reaching for more and more palettes per quarter and shopping my stash better, which I now realize and hopefully I'm able to do in quarter 3. So 12 of the 19 palettes I shared with you were repeats from Q1, meaning instead of the 45% of my collection I may have felt that I had reached for, I actually have only reached for 32% of my eyeshadow palette collection in the first half of the year. And that number is kind of shocking to me. Now, I don't know if I'm going to have a specific consequence or anything like that to not reaching for every single palette in my collection, but I definitely want this as a reminder to shop my stash a bit more, not let things go super neglected, rotate through things, maybe buckle down and wear my makeup more, and meet some goals on the palettes in projects so I can move in something new. I also want to be mindful of reaching for new palettes instead of the same ones when they're not in projects. For example, these two repeats, I reached for the ABH Sultry palette because it's just super easy and neutral when I'm in a rush. I have plenty of other really neutral, beautiful palettes I could have reached for in Q2 rather than the one time I reached for this. And the Dose of Colors Marvelous Mauves palette I reached for these mauve-y matte shades to go with a shade I'm trying to pan. It does pair beautifully, but I have other palettes that have matte mauve shades I could have used as well to help me with rotating through my collection, if that makes sense. So not that I also only want to use each of these palettes one time every year. However, if I'm going to have almost 100 eyeshadow palettes, I do need to be mindful of rotating through them, mixing and matching, and just having fun with my makeup. I don't mind reaching for multiple palettes for an eye look. I reached for technically it was 2 different palettes and then 2 different singles for my eye look today, and that is fun to do, but I also don't want to open up 8 palettes, reach for one shade out of each of them that I could have reached for elsewhere, like they were unique shades, just for the sake of ticking them off for this style video. I don't know. It's just such a weird balance. I don't know what I'm doing. If you have any suggestions, tips, tricks, I would love to hear them in the comments. If you watched both part 1 and 2, I thank you so much, and I would love it if you would leave a yellow heart emoji in the comments below so that I know that you did. If you did enjoy today's video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up so that I know, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!